If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address.
But you want to call it reverse discrimination. If someone comes into your home, bum rushes your house, and black boot stomps your door down, and comes in and puts their gat or their nine on everybody in the house, robs everybody, rapes everybody, then takes the wealth of the home of yours and parlays it into an empire, and one day you are strong enough to take their gun back from them and now stand over them and call them a raper and a robber to their face. The question is, does that make you a reverse robber and a reverse rapist?
I was supposed to let this celebration and commemoration of Khalid Muhammad's birthday wait until tonight, but I can't. I just can't. Today is the birthday of the man, the black man, who put the warrior into warrior scholar. There have been a lot of black folks who are men of letters and numbers and words, but none who really spat it the way that Khalid did. Look, if an accurate history of our people is ever written, if there is a conscientious and committed group of people who documents what is, as Brother Khalid himself put it, our resurrection and rise, if this part of our history is ever accurately described, then it would be an injustice if there was not a chapter devoted to the impact and effort of Brother Khalid. He did and said so many things, and one of them was when he spoke to black people, he did it in a way that took all the various aspects of what is at its core the same black identity and empowerment, and he addressed us on all of those levels. Unless something was just plain wrong and plain anti-black, he would acknowledge it. He would actually honor it. So long as the idea empowered black people and the individuals who held those beliefs wanted empowerment as well. Khalid was one of the few who genuinely understood that a lot of the so-called labels and titles, and even to an extent practices that we had picked up were in fact different facets of the same black diamond. The only people Khalid wanted to separate himself from were the anti-black racists, and you can't blame him. You want someone who was unapologetically black? That was Brother Khalid Muhammad. Seriously. How many black men can you say were so ferocious in their black advocacy that they scared Louis Farrakhan? Khalid was so strident, so powerful, so unrelenting that Louis Farrakhan himself had to back up. Even the white media looked at Khalid and said, we have to be real careful how we handle this guy, because we don't want to run around saying that there's somebody out there more hardcore than Louis Farrakhan, especially with this young generation who's actually warming to that message. We don't want to get out there and say, hey, here's the guy you should be following instead. That's what they did, and yet here we are, decades after Khalid's passing, and nobody dares to say that Brother Khalid was wrong. Brother Khalid made it a point to speak to his people whenever and wherever he could, but he was never afraid to go to these universities or any other white-dominated venue so that he could speak to these brainwashed students or these brain-dead academics. And on the few occasions that a white media outlet was foolhardy enough to have him on air, you could count those instances on one hand, Brother Khalid would challenge any so-called opponent to try to prove him wrong. Anybody wanted to debate him, he would take all comers. As Brother Khalid put it, send us your best so-called experts. Send us the best you got. He had a lot in common with Dr. Ben in that regard. See, there's a very good reason the dominant society only brings on the same handful of boot-licking, buck-dancing clowns to be on their shows. It's to manufacture the idea that these are the responsible black voices, and hence only their lukewarm, brain-dead prattling constitutes a legitimate viewpoint from a black person at least. The white media has a monopoly that they bestowed on themselves, and they use it to brainwash people through the non-stop repetition of lies. As a result, they're ultra-hypersensitive to curating who they allow on their airwaves. Because you put somebody like Khalid on the air, and people realize they're not alone in being suspicious and disdainful of all of this white media nonsense that we see constantly on air or in print. And that was how Brother Khalid built his credibility and his following. The man was unapologetically pro-black, but he was also ready for any anti-black racist lies that the dominant society or anyone else wanted to bring. Brother Khalid didn't just step across the line, he blasted that line into oblivion, and then he challenged these white supremacists to do anything about it. He stepped across the line for all of us. And it's crucial that we hold these people up and venerate them. People like Brother Khalid must be honored. See, as a Gen Xer, I remember how Malcolm X was regarded before Spike Lee made that movie back in 1992. See, before Denzel played Malcolm, you had the black baby boomers, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority, let's call it like it is, who ran away from Malcolm. That's what they've been doing since they were young back in the 60s. Whenever you had the white media put a microphone in front of what do you think about Malcolm X? You would have too many of the black boomers who would say, well, I don't agree with everything he said or even most of it, because the white media would put them on the spot and they refused to stand up for the man's memory because they thought it would offend the dominant society. But by the late 80s, early 90s, Generation X, the so-called post-civil rights generation, had come of age and was seeing that all of this colorblind integrated garbage we had been spoon-fed since the cradle was just a racist fraud, and we were starting to look for people who were talking more like Malcolm. Malcolm sounded real good, at least to us. So when rappers like Public Enemy and others began to openly use quotes and imagery from Malcolm, they were trying to appeal to Gen Xers who were tired of the conformist nonsense that our parents' generation was talking. Why do you think it was that back, especially during the 90s, you had so many quote-unquote urban radio stations who were playing Malcolm X quotes and playing audio from his speeches and lectures? Why do you think that was happening? Because that's what the young people they were trying to appeal to wanted to hear. We could already see that those little few old factory jobs and government jobs that the black baby boomers were only too happy to get were already drying up for us. We weren't going to be having some little old job at the plant. We could see that already. Millennials realized that housing prices were insane, but I'll tell you right now, Gen Xers could already see the problems forming back in the late 90s. See, by the time Gen X came of age, there was finally a generation ready and eager to hear a message like Malcolm's and weren't going to shy away from it. That's why when Spike Lee made that Malcolm X movie, you had all these young people running around with X hats and X's on their shirts. Young people. All of a sudden, the baby boomers who had been trying to appease the dominant society by claiming they didn't agree with all of Malcolm's angry black rhetoric, suddenly all of these 30 and 40-somethings who had previously been talking about how they didn't know anything about Malcolm and didn't agree with him, didn't like him, now they were talking about how they allegedly met Malcolm, or they saw him speak somewhere, or how they had briefly been in the Nation of Islam. That's how they were talking now. Generation X resurrected Malcolm's memory and uplifted him, and suddenly it was fashionable to like Malcolm X. It was Gen X who led the charge to undo the white media's demonizing of our icon. There was massive opposition to this, by the way, so that's part of the historical record that's been allowed to fall down the memory hole. See, back when I was young, you had boomers who were saying to us, those young people with their rap music, who do they think they are sitting here playing Malcolm cuts like that? Some of us were campus radicals back in the 60s, but we grew out of all that. We grew up. When you have people like Spike Lee with the movie School Days, where you had Lawrence Fishburne being dressed down by one of the deans at the school, and they were talking to him about how you're doing the same mess we did in the 60s. That stuff is done. Who do you think you are? That's what they were saying to us back in the early 90s. They sounded like nigga Jim Clyburn today. See, they get older but never wiser. That was the reaction from most of the boomers when they saw young people in the 80s and especially early 90s embracing Malcolm. My point is, it's perfectly understandable that people are not singing Khalid's praises right now. This is history repeating itself. They never do sing the praises of the people that the dominant society aren't celebrating. That's an old post-traumatic slave disorder that a lot of Negroes are indulging in. See, when we began the work of the black media 15 years ago, back when the Kundalini clowns were all the rage, and black political discourse was a dumpster fire, they also ridiculed and mocked us too. Who do y'all think y'all is? You think you some kind of Malcolm X revolutionaries? That's the same stuff that they were saying to us earlier in the 90s, and the same thing that they were saying to Malcolm back in the day. See, they outnumbered us back then. Nobody was talking like us at the time, but we didn't change the message. You look at my Twitter profile. I put that in there, made sure to post it, and made sure that it was up there permanently. I'm not changing the message. The Kundalini clowns, on the other hand, these fools who used to be here, they're all gone now. We're still here. They're not. And the impact we've had is greater than it's ever been in decades, sufficient to affect a presidential election. See, the old dead black windbags, they knew they weren't qualified or equipped to do what we do. They could never co-opt our message because our message was just so stridently, unapologetically black. They couldn't even come close to it for fear of alienating the dominant society. That's how hot the message is. And we all got on code to make it clear that we weren't going to let them co-opt this. That's why these clowns went away. It's not about who laughs the hardest or who laughs the most. It's about who gets the last laugh. And that is us. Despite the ridicule, despite the scorn and the doubters, the day one people who were with the black media from its inception, you remember how bad it was. There were some idiots who tried to make a cottage industry out of attacking us. Well, we put them out of business. We did it by persevering. We outlasted them. And here we are many years after those people have crumbled to dust and you can't even remember their names anymore because we were in it for the long haul, no matter what. And who do you think we learned that kind of perseverance from? We learned it from our icons, like Malcolm and like Khalid. But understand something, when it comes to protecting and preserving the memory and legacy of our icons like Khalid, we will have to defend him not merely from attackers from without, but also backstabbers from within. As an example, Ice Cube began hanging out with racists like Tucker Carlson and saying that racism is overrated. 30 years ago, though, a very young Ice Cube was trying to build some post-NWA credibility by hanging out with Khalid Muhammad. Ice Cube even went so far as to put Brother Khalid in one of his videos. Oh, how much he's changed in the last 30 years, and not for the better. See, Ice Cube is a Gen Xer too, and when he was young and wasn't making millions and didn't have Hollywood putting him in movies and wasn't hobnobbing with white corporate executives and the like or trying to be some sort of sports league owner, he talked very differently than he does today. Yeah, he was one of those people who didn't have a problem with Malcolm's message. Back then, he used to run with a very different crowd. The right crowd. He's developed a very dysfunctional relationship with his own blackness, however. I wonder what Khalid would think about Ice Cube palling around and taking joyrides with a mouth-frothing anti-black racist like Tucker Carlson. Judging by the tongue-lashing Khalid gave Jesse Jackson back in the day, we can all agree he'd have nothing good to say about it. The problem is Khalid's not here to speak the truth, and to be honest, we shouldn't need him at this point. We're not babies. Khalid simply said out loud what his people had been saying under their breaths, but didn't have the guts to say out loud. At some point, we have to act like we have a spine and speak up for ourselves instead of hiding behind someone else and waiting for somebody else to do it. See, that was one of the civil rights movement's fatal flaws, trying to get behind some individual like they were some workhorse that was going to pull the rest of them to liberation. Power doesn't work like that, especially not the kind that's supposed to empower an entire group. There's only one way to distinguish the real from the phony: time. Give someone enough time and they'll reveal exactly who and what they truly are. Khalid remained consistent until his final breath. No amount of white media demonization, pressure from the U.S. government, or people turning their backs on him from inside the NOI could change that. The only thing more cowardly than refusing to embrace heroes like Khalid Muhammad is when you have someone who's seen the light, who's accepted the truth, and then turned their backs on it because there was more money to be made kissing white supremacist behinds. Well, we don't shy away from our heroes. If they make white power uncomfortable, good. That's what a moral person is supposed to do, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But you'll never speak truth to power unless you first have courage. It's difficult to stand for what's right, especially when you have to stand alone. But the few people who actually do it, those are the ones who deserve our respect. It took nearly 20 years after his death for Malcolm's words to finally find a generation ready to hear them, and we've done our part to make sure the white media's attempt to shame us back into silence didn't work. Today you have TV shows like The Godfather of Harlem and even movies like One Night in Miami that feature Malcolm X in them. And they're not doing it to demonize him either, are they? Once black youth stopped being afraid to mention Malcolm's name with reverence 30 years ago and not being afraid to displease white power by acknowledging our icons, the ones that they hated, that's when the bad guys backed off. This was the kind of courage and self-respect that Khalid fought to instill in his people, and this is why we must honor him. White power uses their media to honor genocidal maniacs like Columbus and degenerate slave-owning rapists like Thomas Jefferson. And then those in the dominant society pretend like these were such great men. Well, we don't need television specials or a parade or movies to honor our icons, though there's nothing wrong with having those things. We should make sure that our heroes and sheroes receive the place of honor that they earned. They all deserve a parade, statues in their honor, a national holiday, the whole nine. But the one thing that our icons deserve the most is to be remembered and for us to honor them by living out the values they taught us. We can't run away from them because they're not popular with the white supremacist society, or we embrace them but run away from them because we're hoping to climb the social ladder. See, our heroes are real. We come from a rich tradition of freedom fighters and moral leaders. The dominant society can't say that. They have to make up their heroes. Moral men from the dominant society only exist in their imaginations. But the men and women of honor in our culture are flesh and blood, real people. The dominant society can't hold up their so-called heroes because they don't have any. All they have are genocidal slave owners and murderous opportunists like the robber barons. That and cutthroat frauds like Thomas Edison. This is the closest they have to heroes. They have to constantly apologize for them, tell everyone to overlook genocides, plural, mass rapes, weaving barbarity and slaughter into the national fabric, and pathetically trying to make excuses for the inexcusable. They can't claim to have improved. Every change in this society, and I mean every single one, was the sole result of our efforts, our advocacy, our demands over their violent objections. We had to force it on them. They fought against morality and decency every step of the way. Their depravity so deeply ingrained, they fought a civil war to avoid having to act like human beings, and even the Union was led by a racist murderer. Abraham Lincoln was as racist as Jefferson Davis. So this is why we see constant attempts to smear and slander our heroes, because they want to bring true icons down to their level. They look at the sorry lot of figures their culture has produced, and they realize that theirs pale in comparison to ours. History is indeed a story. And people like Khalid Muhammad reminded the dominant society who the villains are in this little tale, and they hated him for it. He refused to allow them to rewrite the history books or to rewrite their place in it. He reminded everyone who the bad guys were. And he was one of the people who was most instrumental in helping to impress upon me the need to detach myself from the white media's so-called entertainment and news. And this is why I spend so much time telling you that it's dangerous to go falling in love with the kinds of TV shows that have become so in vogue the last 25 years. That's why for over 15 years I've been saying the white media is not in the business of entertainment. They're in the business of mind control. Khalid taught me that. Do you think it's a coincidence that the white media began flooding the culture with all manner of anti-heroes, from The Sopranos to Breaking Bad to you name it? All these images of anti-heroes are being pushed on you because it's meant to condition you to have sympathy for the devil in the real world. They're conditioning you to accept their liars, their cutthroats and killers, on some level at least. Make it where you look at them and go, well, we do have to understand them, don't we? No, we don't. If you're moral, then it's a no-brainer that you choose a good person over a bad one. But under white supremacy, there's no choice between good and evil. It's just bad and worse. Again, this is skillful media manipulation. It's just like I've told you about the white media's straw man version of a racist. The Hollywood version of a racist isn't even a stereotype. It's far less believable than that. What the white media invented is a ridiculous caricature, one that would enable the dominant society to see some clown screaming racial slurs and say, yeah, that's a racist. It certainly isn't me. And by presenting the world with that total distortion of a racist, the white media conditioned the public to think that that is the only thing that a racist is. And then you got most black people wondering how it is that so many people in the dominant society are on code with the same talking point that, you can't be racist unless you use the N-word. But he didn't use the N-word, so he can't be racist, And even when one of them does use the N-word or some other source of racial slurs, they then fall back to, rappers do it too, even if the rappers don't. White media manipulation. Khalid warned you about their media just like Malcolm before him. They use their media to miseducate you about the world, and they'll get away with it if you're not listening to black people who are trying to inform you about the world. They distort your concept of right and wrong. They condition you to accept the unacceptable, and some of you to forgive the unforgivable. That's how you can have black people being gunned down the streets, ruthlessly murdered by people who intended to kill black people, and they'll have a camera in front of them and the first words out of their mouths, I forgive them. You got black people who know better than that, but they're saying it because they've been conditioned to, and that being the case, black people need to start walking in Khalid's footsteps, and that means thinking and acting for yourself again. And when you do, you'll realize that you're acting and thinking in ways the dominant society doesn't like, and worst of all, you no longer care whether they like it or not. Thinking for yourself and thinking only for yourself. And we must, because nobody else has ever looked out for us. These commemorations that I do is because the only true education that a black person is going to get is the one that they go out and get for themselves. And this goes doubly for black children. Black parents in particular need to make sure that they and the community around them are supposed to educate and condition black children on what is in their interest and what is worthy of them to celebrate and respect. Because if you don't, they're going to tell you that slave owners and genocidal anti-black maniacs are the ones you ought to uplift and respect. Holidays exist for a reason, and that's to keep the past alive in the collective memory of the culture. You make it festive and celebratory so that people are attracted to it. They associate joy and good feelings with these annual remembrances. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. Problem is, under white supremacy, nobody's going to celebrate men and women who dedicated their lives to establishing justice in a world that's been perverted by anti-black racism. Nobody's going to uplift overturning the racial pyramid scheme that all of these other groups in the country depend on for every crumb of their daily bread. We live in a world where the bad guys are in charge, and in that kind of environment, telling the truth is a crime. Look at what's happening in Florida. The goal is to put a chilling effect on black people, to scare black people into silence. Well, the way to fight this kind of evil is to do so boldly, stand up and speak the truth, and do it ferociously like Khalid did. It's like I've always told you, if we fight, we win. And that was what Brother Khalid did. That's why we have to honor his memory, because he fought every single day. He fought every single enemy he came across for the glory and honor of his people. I've long said that at some point a generation forged of iron would need to arise, and that they would take a hard-nosed approach to our power, and it is our task to hasten the day when that generation arises. And when they do, they're going to look back at our reluctance to embrace, uplift, and honor icons like Khalid with the same shame and disdain that we regard the baby boomers with when it comes to Malcolm. I hope that Brother Khalid is watching us, and that his spirit emboldens us to challenge the enemy, provoke the enemy, show fearlessness in the face of evil, but most of all, to call the devil by his name, and to do so ferociously, no matter who doesn't like it.